I'm Mason Marangella from Vertex Effects with Sweetwater, today to talk to you about a product that has been in development for over a decade. It is our Vertex buffer interface boxes. Now, before we get into the particulars of these buffers, I want to first just generally define what a buffer actually is and what it does. So a buffer is designed to take the high impedance guitar signals that are really sensitive to really anything that comes after them and convert that signal to a low impedance signal, which basically is a signal that is much less sensitive than what the guitar pickups would be putting out. Now, this is important because guitar pedals have all different sorts of impedances between them, and there are no standards. So what the buffer helps do is normalize the cabling and all of the signal that's running between the guitar and the amplifier to kind of create a baseline so that there isn't so much variability when pedals are coming on and off. And this particular buffer interface that we've designed has multiple different buffers that you can route in different locations depending on your exact rig, amplifier, guitar, and pedal selection. However, I think the one thing to be named about buffers is that they often have a bad reputation because of poor buffers that have already been in existence. A lot of people will say, well, I don't like the sound of buffer, it colors my tone in a way that I don't like, or it makes my tone sound really bright. And I have to say that most of the buffers that are out there actually do that. So I do feel that it's appropriate that people feel that buffers have undermined the sound that they have spent so much time to create. However, a well-built buffer has no color of its own. It literally is taking the exact same signal that's coming in on the guitar and just converting it to low impedance with no artifacts, no compression, no EQ changes whatsoever. What comes in is what goes out. And we've spent the last decade painstakingly voicing our buffer so that it has no character other than exactly what your guitar is putting into it. So let's actually test it and just see how neutral it really is. I'm going to take a guitar cable that's 10 feet, going to go right into my amplifier, strum a couple chords. Then I'm going to take that same 10-foot guitar cable, I'm going to plug it into the buffer. I'm going to run 100 feet of the same cable after the buffer and then go into the amplifier and see if there's any difference. So here's the 10-foot guitar cable straight into the amp, couple of G chords. Let's hear how it sounds. Now I'm going to take this 10-foot cable, plug it into the input buffer, then run 100 feet of cable out of the input buffer into the front of the amp so we can hear how the buffer drives that 100 feet of cable and whether there's any difference. It sounds pretty dang close to me. Let's hear again the 10-foot cable. Now let's hear that 10-foot cable with the buffer and then 100 feet of cable. Really almost identical, not only in terms of the sound, but the response under my fingers doesn't change. I don't hear any compression. I don't hear any EQ change. And this is what a good buffer does. And a lot of us have come to generalize based on bad buffers that buffers somehow hurt the tone. But if you're getting the right buffer that's designed for this application, and as somebody who's been building pedalboard rigs and buffers for almost 15 years, I can tell you that this is truly doing the job of the buffer and is not going to change the core elements of the tone that you've already developed. But let's now talk about the two different buffers that are available. Now, these two buffers are identical. The circuit boards are exactly the same. The components are exactly the same. The only difference is the metal enclosure that they're placed into. And the one on my right here, is designed for everyday guitar players that have a rig that maybe isn't one that's designed by us at Vertex Effects. This could be a pedal train, Tempo Audio, any variety of pedal board this will work on, and it is really for players that want to have something that's flexible that they can take and place into any rig. Now this can mount to your pedal board with Velcro, dual lock, or power grip. Really any type of Velcro will work for this to mount to your pedal board. The other one on my left, again, is the exact same buffer, but is designed explicitly for our Vertex pedal board systems and mounts into your pedal board using the 3 machine screws that you can see on the front of the enclosure. Just for the sake of expediency, I'm just going to be holding up and using the standalone buffer as our exemplar today. even though both perform the exact same functions. So how many buffers are in this, you might ask? There are 4 total available buffers. We have 1 on the input, we have 1 on the effects return, and then we have 2 output buffers. So 4 in total that are available. Now you may be asking yourself, what if I have a fuzz or some sort of impedance sensitive device? We've thought of that. The send on the interface allows you to wire in a fuzz or any impedance sensitive device. So you can go guitar into the send, feed your impedance sensitive devices like old wahs, fuzzes, treble boosters, things of that nature, and then come back and catch the input buffer back on the guitar end and just plugging into that after you go through all of your impedance sensitive devices. The send is also a multi-jack that can be used for several different things because it is passive in TRS. This means that it could be used as a MIDI pass-through, converting 5-pin DIN to TRS MIDI, and then TRS MIDI back to 5-pin DIN if you wanted to use it as a MIDI through. This can also be used, again, as we talked about, as a passive input if you have a fuzz or any sort of impedance-sensitive pedals. And it can also be used to send a foot switch through if you have an amplifier with a TRS or TS foot switch. You can use that to feed through the interface to reach a switcher or some other external foot switch that's going to be switching back at the amplifier end. Now equally, we have a buffered return that allows you to buffer the return going back to an effects loop. Ordinarily, most effects loops, even if they are buffered, it's only on the send. You still need a way to get that output and that cable back to the amplifier. So putting a buffer on the return just ensures that you're getting that low output impedance signal throughout the entire effects loop. Equally, we have 2 output buffers for the left and right outputs if you're running stereo or split output. And we also have an isolation transformer with a polarity switch so that you can make sure that you get total galvanic isolation of your 2 amplifiers. Again, whether that's stereo, whether that's split mono, whether that's wet, dry, wet, you can ensure that you're getting an absolute quiet, ground hum free rig that's going to perform exactly the way that you expect. And that polarity switch ensures that the 2 amps remain in phase as you're running a multiple amp setup. Everything runs on 9 volts on the input. There's no need to add more voltage than that. It's already running at max headroom internally, so you have all the headroom that you're going to need in order to ensure that there is 0 clipping. And for the isolation transformer, we're using an audiophile grade transformer that sounds absolutely transparent, that will not distort or clip irrespective of the pedals that are running into it, which is often a problem with many other isolation transformers and other available over-the-counter buffers. Also, as a bonus feature, you can use the effects loop if you don't happen to have amps with effects loops as an audition loop or insert loop to bring in effects off of the pedal board but in the middle of your signal path. It allows you to use the return as an output and the send as an input. So you can send out to external effects wherever in the signal path it is that you want. And if you do use an audition loop and you've wired that function into the interface and you're not using any external pedals for any particular gig, just use a short patch cable and that will ensure that it bridges the send to the return so it doesn't break the signal path when you're not using an effect externally. Also, one other thing to name is that there isn't a tuner out on this interface box. In order to ensure that we are getting the most value and bang for the buck, we did not include a tuner out, but there is an easy way to make a tuner out from this box. All you need to do on the output of the input buffer, which is this jack right over here, is just put a Y cable. And I'll show a Y cable above so you know exactly what it is that I'm talking about. It's basically just a splitter cable, and one side will go to the first pedal in your signal path, and the other side of the Y cable will feed the input of the tuner. That's exactly what would be done inside of any sort of buffer interface box. It would just be done internally, paralleling that output jack, instead of doing it externally with a cable. There wouldn't be any degradation of the tone, and there wouldn't be any parallel loading. Again, with that 100 ohm output impedance, it's going to have no problem driving that Y cable with 0 color whatsoever. So now that we have the technical specifications out of the way, I want to show you some of the most common ways that you might wire the Vertex buffer interface. Now, again, I'm showing you based on the standalone version. The module, again, will be the exact same buffer, exact same features, exact same jacks. Everything is exactly the same, but just for ease of understanding these visuals, we're going to keep with the standalone buffer as we go through these different wiring schemes. Now, if you're wondering other ways to wire in the buffer interface, or you forget about this video or don't know exactly where to locate them, we've got you covered on both the standalone and on the module-based version of the buffer interface. We have a QR code on the back that you can scan with your phone, and it will take you directly to our webpage where it has all the wiring diagrams already spelled out for you. I'm going to show you how to wire the interface for a mono system, stereo system, 4 cable method system, and a wet-dry-wet system. And these are just a few ways that you could wire the Vertex buffer interfaces. And again, we'll have alternative diagrams linked in the description, and also you can always scan the QR code on the back of all the interfaces if you want to know all the different ways that we're aware of. And of course, we're going to be adding to this list as you start to submit new and different ways that maybe we hadn't even thought of ways to wire the buffer interface. First, let's start with mono. So as you see here in mono, we got the guitar coming into the guitar input on the interface box. That's where it's hitting the input buffer. Then it's feeding a tuner, then an overdrive, then a boost, then a chorus, and then it's feeding the time-based effects, delay, and reverb, and then it's going back into the input left, which is catching the output buffer, which is then feeding back to the amp. So you have an input buffer and an output buffer. Very simple, common setup here for mono. Now let's go to stereo. We can see the guitar is coming into the guitar input. It's getting buffered there with the input buffer. Then it's going to the tuner, then to an overdrive, then to a boost, then to the chorus. And then it's going to start the stereo section after it goes into the delay, stereo out of the delay, into the reverb, out stereo from the reverb, into input left and input right, which are feeding amps left and right. Both of those amps receiving an output buffer. And again, we have the polarity control to make sure that those two amps have the same polarity and that they are in phase with each other. And that right output has an isolated output. So we're making sure that the second amp has total galvanic isolation from the first amp so that there's no ground hum. Next, we have 4 cable methods. So you can see here, guitar is still coming into the guitar input. It's receiving the input buffer there, converting the signal to low impedance, hitting the tuner, the overdrive, the boost, the chorus, and then the chorus is feeding the input of the amp by going in left and then going out of the amp left into the amp input. Then amp send is going to feed into the send of the effects loop section of the interface. It's going to feed the delay and the reverb, which are all the time-based effects, and then out of the reverb, it's going to return back to the amp by going into the return jack and going out and receiving another output buffer there, which is then feeding the return of the effects loop return. Let's now look at a wet-dry-wet system. We have the guitar coming into the input buffer, receiving that first buffer, then feeding the tuner, then feeding the overdrive, then the boost, then the chorus. Chorus then goes in front of the amp by going into the input left and out of the amp left to feed the dry amplifier. So far, all these effects are in front of the dry. Then out of the dry amp, we have a line out box or a line out of just the dry amp itself that might be built in. And then that's feeding the effects send, which is then feeding all the time-based effects in stereo, the delay in stereo, and reverb in stereo. And then output left of the reverb is going to hit the return of the effects loop section of the interface and feed the wet left amp. And then out of the reverb output right, it's going to feed the input right and go out of amp right output, which is all galvanically isolated with the ISO transformer. That's then going to feed the wet right amplifier. So this puts all of our dry effects and the chorus in front of the dry amplifier, and then puts all of our wet processing effects, hard pan left and right, into the 2 wet amplifiers, wet left and wet right, again with the dry in the center. So I hope this was something that you found valuable. I know that buffers are not always the thing that we want to spend the big money on, but it is one of those things that's going to ensure that you get the very most out of all the pedals that you've invested in for your rig, to ensure that not only are you going to get that same tone as the guitar plugged into the amplifier with nothing in between when all your pedals are in bypass, but when your pedals are on, they're going to perform the way that they would as though it was just the guitar and the amplifier and nothing else in between. That's really the performance that we want out of our pedals, and we're spending all that money on pedals to get the most out of them. Why not make sure that you have a high quality buffered system for the input buffer and the output buffer to insulate the tone and ensure that you're getting reliable and consistent results day in and day out, whether that's in studio or on stage. So I know that was a lot to get through, but with all this information about this product, if you're interested in purchasing one, I highly recommend that you get in touch with your Sweetwater sales engineer. Not only are they going to be familiar with all the different routing diagrams that we talked about today, in addition to some of the other ones that are going to be linked in the description, they're going to be able to tell you how to best fit this into your rig and where you might want to place it in relationship to the other pedals. Secondly, if you enjoyed this content, I highly recommend that you like and subscribe to the Sweetwater YouTube channel. This will be able to keep you up to date with all the product releases and videos that Sweetwater is coming out with every week. So definitely do give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon. And until next time, I'm Mason Marangella from Vertex Effects. See you later.